Yeah, if you didn't know that little part about me, most of the world knows seemingly everything about me. What they don't know is that I live in Kansas City, Gladstone to be exact. Good to see some of my fellow parishioners from St. Andrew the Apostle, but grateful to see all of you. And, none of this is a coincidence. It never is. But I want to set the stage by telling you last night I was in Dallas, Texas with David B. Wright, one of the co-founders of 40 Days for Life, and Abby Johnson and her team as they celebrated over 600 abortion workers going through their ministry. And I know that so many of you are a part of that success. So, absolutely. And as if it wasn't great enough to see this last night, and if you've never met some of the quitters, you need to, because not only are their stories powerful, but they have so much joy, so much peace because of leaving the abortion industry, being supported, finding healing. And as every time I hear Abby speak, I always recognize that Abby, as a former abortion clinic director, and myself, the survivor of a failed abortion, we have far more in common than we do different. Trust me, we have far more in common by the grace of God, because we have a passion for saving the lives of the unborn. We have a passion for healing our population of people that have been hurt by abortion. And by the grace of God, we're both pretty bold and passionate women. But one of the things that I haven't even told Melanie about last night, as I was speaking with some people at this event, there was a campaign director out of Texas for 40 Days for Life. And he was telling me about how he looks to other places in the United States to figure out things that he wants to pull from people's campaigns because he sees them doing great things. Guess who he brought up? This location. Isn't that amazing? It was your day captain piece in particular. He said, I love that. I'm trying to replicate it here. And he had great things, of course, to say about our friends on the Missouri side, Mike and Kathy Fork, and the amazing work that they do over there. And so I just want you to know that you may not be out and about as much as I am, but you are making a difference, and other people know that you're doing it. And I'm here today with, yes, I know, a very miraculous story. But I want to encourage you today to recognize that I'm an ordinary person just like you, who by the grace of God is called to do something extraordinary every single day. And yes, God gave me a certain experience and a voice and allowed me a platform to go out and make a difference. But with everything I do, and trust me, you're probably going to see some things I'm doing this week politically, because we know the fight is on in Washington to codify Roe. And yes, I have some plans to make my presence known in the midst of that. But none of those things are as important as being here today with all of you. And that makes me really emotional, because that's how important the sidewalk is to me. No one could save me that day 44 years ago, but not because they didn't want to, because we didn't have 40 Days for Life at that time. There were people outside of St. Luke's Hospital in Sioux City, Iowa. That's where I was aborted, and I was accidentally born alive. There were people out there back in the late 70s into the 1980s, just like you, who were praying that abortions would be stopped at that hospital. They were praying that somehow lives would be spared. When I survived that failed abortion on August 29th of 1977, and if you know anything about feast days, that's a pretty important day, isn't it? When I was accidentally born alive that day, I know that the words started to circulate in the community. And of course, it brought people a lot of hope to know that an abortion had failed and a little girl had lived. But they did not know, of course, if I had continued to live, what my life had looked like, where I would ever be. But by the grace of God, he called me forward to share not only my story, but now their story with the world. And I want to share a little bit about my story with you, for those of you who don't know a little bit about what I survived. I know my birth mother, Ruth, looked an awful lot like the women who come through the doors of this abortion clinic still today. Ruth was 19. She was a college student. She wasn't married to my biological father. And sadly, one of the greatest statistics she fits is one that isn't talked about in our predominant culture, and that's coercion. I'm sure if you've spent any time out on this sidewalk, you can tell story after countless story of women like Ruth who go through those doors not by choice, but often by circumstance, coercion, and force. And statistically, we know upwards of well over 64% of women identify feeling pressured into their abortion. If we ever could drill down the exact number of women who experience coercion and force, I think our world would need to reckon with itself, because there is no choice for most women when it comes to abortion. In Ruth's circumstance, I now know that it wasn't her choice. It wasn't just coercion. It was literally forced upon her against her will. My maternal grandmother was a prominent nurse in their community. I have my own suspicions she probably performed abortions at that hospital from time to time. Chances would be very good given her experience. But she had a very close working relationship with the abortionist there at that hospital. She certainly had been there when abortions had been performed. And she knew how to make a secret forced abortion take place on her own daughter, bypassing hospital regulations and procedures at the time. Ruth did not want to abort me, but she was given no other choice. She was forced into that hospital and a saline infusion was started. And abortion is never a pleasant thing to look at or hear about. But I'll share a little bit about that procedure if any of you aren't aware of what that saline infusion involves. It involves injecting a toxic salt solution into the amniotic fluid surrounding that preborn child in the womb. The intent of that toxic salt solution is to poison and scald the child to death. Children like me are actually called the red-skinned or candy apple babies because that toxic salt solution would turn the skin bright red as it peeled it away and moved internally into the organs. If the child was fortunate enough, their life was ended within about the first 24 hours. And then labor was induced with the intent of that deceased child being expelled from the womb. It's a horrific procedure for a child to be submitted to. And I can tell you it's a horrific procedure for women to be put through. I have met so many women like Ruth who can tell me how they felt their child thrashing about in the womb, fighting for their life before things finally became quiet and they knew what had been done. In my case, I soaked in that toxic salt solution, not for 24 hours, not for 3 days, but 5. Why? Well, I like to joke to my husband I'm a little stubborn and I just wasn't going to budge willingly. I like to think God gave me this personality. I think he knew what he was doing. But we also know that they just could not successfully induce Ruth's labor, and so they tried time and time again until finally on the 5th day her labor was induced. And I was delivered in the final step of that procedure at St. Luke's Hospital, believing I would be a successful abortion. And lo and behold, that day, I was accidentally born alive. I think we can give God a round of applause in that, can't we? This is why I spend my time on the sidewalk in DC, out and about in the world, healing my population of survivors and families. The list could go on and on, because too many children are not afforded the same opportunity I was given. And trust me, I am no different than those tens of millions of children who you will never see. But that's also why we're here, to give them a voice, to show the world that they have a face and a name, that they are never forgotten in this world, and every single one of those children are worth fighting for. And people fought for me that day. I wish I could tell you that when I was accidentally born alive, all of the medical professionals saw my inherent dignity and value like you do. But when we talk about born alive legislation in our world, it's because children like me are not immediately provided medical care, and sometimes not provided medical care at all. I now know that demands were made to leave me to die in the hospital room. My adoptive parents were told years ago that it was the abortionist who demanded that I be left to die. That would make sense, wouldn't it? But we now know that it wasn't the abortionist. It was someone much closer to me, my grandmother. Not only did she force that abortion, she heavily monitored it, and coming face to face with her firstborn grandchild that day, she demanded that I be left there to die. And I don't fault her for that. This is what abortion has done to our society. People make life and death decisions about people like me every single day, regardless of their relationship. And I share it also with you because I want you to continue to love the people impacted by abortion. I want you to love the women who are coming through the doors of this center. I want you to love their fathers. I want you to love their families who so many times think this is the only option or aren't thinking about the impact this is going to have on that child's life and the rest of their lives for generations. I want you to have love for the abortion clinic workers like my friend Abby. I want you to have compassion and love for abortionists and former abortionists like my friend Dr. Steve Hammond. We love, and I love my grandmother in spite of every decision she ever made about my life, knowing that she probably never could have loved me in return. That's radical love, the way we are called to live it out. And radical love is why I'm alive today. I was placed for adoption. My parents knew that I would likely have multiple disabilities throughout my life, and they knew that they were called to be my parents. If you don't know me very well, you might be wondering, is there something wrong with her that we don't see today? Well, that's a loaded question. It wouldn't be that anything is wrong. It would be still that everything is right. But no matter what the doctor's prognosis for my life was back then, I am pretty healthy and whole today, thanks be to God. My story of life could have been very short in the grand scheme of things. Just another life ended by abortion. But God has given me this beautiful, amazing life story. And as I close my time with you today, I want to share with you just how much hope exists out on this sidewalk, how much hope exists in this world. My family and I moved here to Kansas City back in 2013. I'm an Iowa girl, born and raised. I'm a Hawkeye, hold it against me, love me for it. I know, Rob, I knew that one was for you back there. But we moved here to Kansas City. My husband took a job at the Community Blood Center. My husband's in the IT department there. And when we moved to Kansas City, we never could have fathomed that God had a plan of restoration and reconciliation right here in Kansas City. I had been living in Sioux City, Iowa, the very same city where my birth mother Ruth's abortion had taken place with me years before. We lived there for many, many years. I gave birth to our first daughter, Olivia, at the same hospital where my life was supposed to end. Trust me, that's a great story. But we moved from that city where the abortion had taken place, where I learned that my birth father was still living. We moved to Kansas City, and I was somehow thinking, I am never going to have any kind of communication with my birth mother, Ruth. I had looked for her for years, had some communication with her family, and things were very secretive. Now I know why. But we moved here, and I never could have fathomed that not long after moving here, I would get an email from one of her cousins who needed to break some important news to me. Ruth lives in the Kansas City metro area, and so does one of my half-sisters. They also had to share the heartbreaking news with me that not only was that abortion forced on Ruth, but Ruth had spent over 30 years of her life believing that I had died that day at the hospital. People knew. They knew at the hospital. They knew on the sidewalk. Her family knew, but they kept it a secret. And of course, we have our own opinions on why that is. But what I can tell you is that she lived with over 30 years of incredible regret, wishing that she could have done something to save her child's life. She didn't know if I had been a little boy or a little girl. She was simply told, it's hideous, it's a monster, don't look at it. And when we moved to Kansas City, all the truth started to pour out, and Ruth and I started to communicate. And yes, those were some difficult conversations, as you can imagine. To go from believing your child had died in an abortion to knowing your child is alive and lives a very public life. She questioned how I could ever love her the way that I said I did. She questioned how I could ever forgive her and anyone in her family. And so we spent a number of years building these walls of trust and love so she could understand that when I say I love her, I mean it. And we met face to face for the first time almost 5 years ago now. My children are 13 and 7. You might see them here in a little bit. But my kids grow up now knowing Grandma Ruth is just another one of their grandmothers. My 13-year-old knows our family story. And she knows that as much as abortion has impacted our lives, hope and love and forgiveness are the storylines of our lives. And my children grow up alongside their cousins in Blue Springs. If God can do this in my family's lives, if I can be spared from abortion, what can't he do on this sidewalk in the next 40 days? I'm going to come back here. You can hold me to it. You tell Annie I said it. And I want to know what happens out here on the sidewalk, because with everything happening in our world, in Texas, in DC, you name it, you are needed on this sidewalk now more than ever. Let's show the world what it means to be truly pro-life and pro-love. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.